The Lost World was a computer game designed for 32 players, each acting as a god guiding their own civilization. Among them, Choi Sung-woon was one of the most skilled. Black smoke rose in towering columns against the crimson sky, streaked with flashes of light. The battlefield burned fiercely as two mighty civilizations clashed. Thousands of soldiers from both armies advanced, their footsteps thundering across the earth, joined by the grinding march of colossal weapons. Against the red-stained heavens, countless sharpened spears glittered as though freshly forged. The wind carried the banner of Sun-Won's army, swaying gently above the ranks. Directly across from them, the enemy's red flag burned like an unquenchable fire. The fading sunlight reflected off the polished weapons, igniting the air with brilliance. Beneath the blue standard stood the elves' Sun-Won's chosen race. They revered him as the god Nebula and conquered new lands in his honor. Their adversaries were the orcs, towering green giants armed with fangs and ferocity, defending their domain of hegemony with an unbreakable wall of bodies and steel. Suddenly, spears rained down upon the elves. Fearless horsemen charged, riding beasts hardened by countless battles. Every warrior stood prepared to fight to the death. Sun-Won's fingers raced across the gaming keyboard, issuing commands with lightning speed. He yearned for victory with every ounce of his being. The orc warriors struck with enchanted hammers, smashing through the elves' defenses. The cavalry faltered under the relentless assault, holding the line only by sheer willpower. Gun-wielding soldiers advanced, unleashing a synchronized volley of hundreds of shots that rattled the battlefield. Thick gray smoke from spent gunpowder blanketed the ground. As it cleared, massive cannons emerged, belching fire with each thunderous blast. The orcs, however, wielded sorcery of their own. Their priests raised invisible magical barriers, deflecting the deadly cannon fire. But Sun-Won's determination did not waver. He armed his elves with new weaponry, refusing to believe hegemony could withstand him. A keystroke later, the roar of engines filled the air. Squadrons of planes soared into the sky above the battlefield. His opponent, the god of the orcs, was equally cunning and ruthless. He had already claimed countless victories and would not surrender easily. Channeling his divine power, he summoned torrents of lightning that tore through the skies, striking the elven army with merciless force. Everything in its path was reduced to ash. The two gods maneuvered their forces like chess pieces. Every move from one side drew an immediate counter from the other, and the battle stretched on without pause. Flames consumed the sky as planes were torn apart by the orc god's magic, falling one after another in blazing wreckage. Explosions shook the earth, while black acidic smoke cloaked the battlefield in chaos. Suddenly, a prompt appeared on Sun-Won's screen, a question: would he deploy nuclear weapons? Without hesitation, he confirmed. The monitor lit up as intercontinental ballistic missiles, armed with nuclear warheads, prepared for launch. In the name of Nebula, the missiles ascended into the sky, leaving trails of smoke and fire. Their sole mission: annihilate the enemy and secure ultimate victory for the elves. Warriors on both sides gazed upwards in horror. Even the bravest fighters trembled at the sight of the terrible storm descending upon them. But Sun-Won's opponent was no ordinary adversary. He was a master strategist, every bit as skilled. Only the two of them had survived to reach the final stage of the Lost World, and the orcs had their own air defense waiting. In response, the Hegemony launched anti-ballistic missiles from its territory. God Nebula was briefly taken aback by the effectiveness of their air defense system, but instead of discouraging him, it only heightened his excitement. The final ballistic missile was launched from the elf missile base, soaring so high into the atmosphere that no defense system could detect it. This missile was unlike anything seen before. It split into 3 separate warheads, each carrying its own devastating charge, programmed to strike its designated target. Drawing upon the supernatural essence of his character, Sun-W, in the guise of God Nebula, set off toward the orc ruler's castle. The missile closed in at incredible speed. Just a few more seconds, and the once great nation would be erased without a trace. Meanwhile, the ruler of the Hegemony retreated to a fortified bunker, where an altar had been prepared for desperate prayers. Surrounded by his loyal subjects, he pleaded with his god for protection, convinced that sincere devotion would grant their deity greater power. The orc ruler lifted his hands to the heavens, tears streaming down his face. Was this truly the end of his reign over the glorious people of the Hegemony? In the lost world, faith itself was a potent force. It empowered gods to perform miracles, but to stop such an overwhelming ballistic strike, an immense amount of spiritual energy was required. Prayer became the channel for this power. Their collective faith rose into the sky like flocks of radiant birds, forming great wings that enveloped the missiles, absorbing the nuclear devastation. Slowly, the luminous energy coalesced into the colossal silhouette of a deity, towering hundreds of meters high. One by one, the missiles were consumed by this manifestation, vanishing into the emerald hand of faith. In this game, faith was not merely devotion, it was a weapon, and a formidable strategy. Sun W's opponent had clearly amassed vast reserves of faith. The orc god reveled in this triumph, standing proudly upon the shoulder of his divine projection. His every gesture radiated satisfaction at turning the tide of battle. With this, he was certain the god Nebula had no choice but to surrender and accept second place. To him, victory seemed absolute. But Sun W only smirked faintly at the computer monitor. He knew Vera's strategy well after all, it was popular within gaming circles. From the start, the orc player had leaned on the strengths of his race. Their rapidly multiplying numbers had fueled immense faith, and their deity had claimed the skies as his domain. Tornadoes and lightning became his weapons, and his reign above the clouds seemed absolute. But while the heavens belonged to the orc god, space itself was beyond his reach. That was where Sun W's true weapon came into play. Orbiting the planet was a seemingly ordinary satellite, but inside it was a devastating surprise: 3 tungsten rods. Though simple in design, each rod weighed nearly 10 tons. Slowly, they began their descent. The orc god froze in disbelief as these colossal weapons appeared out of nowhere, descending with unstoppable momentum. He ordered his energy assistant to intercept them immediately. Failure would mean the destruction of the orc lord's castle. But gravity was merciless. With each passing second, the rods accelerated, friction igniting their surfaces with heat. The orc god's assistant summoned his full strength, forging an invisible shield to resist them. Yet it was too late. At hypersonic speed, one rod pierced through the divine warrior of faith energy, tearing through with sheer scientific force. The momentum was relentless. The tungsten spear smashed into the castle roof, ripping through multiple floors in an instant. Even this did not stop its programmed path, it continued its devastating plunge, accelerating with every heartbeat, driven by the cold certainty of science. After the floor crumbled beneath his unstoppable onslaught, nothing could hinder his advance until he reached his goal. The rod pierced through the bunker before the prayer altar, unleashing a shockwave that sent stone columns crashing in every direction. At the altar, the orc lord knelt in prayer, clutching the idol of their deity only for it to be shattered in an instant beneath the crushing weight of a searing, red-hot rod. The once majestic castle began to collapse, its towering walls reduced to rubble one after another. Within minutes, only ruins remained. Vera's resources dwindled alongside the fall of the fortress, and countless orcs perished that day. With their deaths, their faith in the deity crumbled as well. The god of hegemony felt his power waning, his energy no longer sustained by worship. His enormous incarnation began to unravel, its form dissolving into the air like morning mist. Nothing could stop Nebula's relentless assault. The winner's avatar appeared upon the screen. The god Nebula had once again secured the #1 spot in the Lost World. He had cleared every mission the game had to offer. Suddenly, a window flashed across the screen with the image of the god of hegemony. It was a direct challenge, a demand for revenge, and an invitation to play another round. Yet a strange thought crossed his mind: was there something more hidden behind this victory? Something he had overlooked? It was already late, and he prepared to exit the game and shut down his computer. Just then, the sound of a new message startled him. His expression shifted to surprise. Who could be messaging him at such an hour? Driven by curiosity, he moved the mouse and clicked. The contents left him even more shocked. The message was about the lost world. A chill ran through him. Perhaps this was not the end. The message congratulated him on earning a platinum achievement. He was the only player to unlock every award. The game had only been in test mode, but now an official release was planned. San's heart pounded as he read on. He had received a unique offer to participate in the full version before its launch. The moment Sun-woon pressed the confirmation button, darkness engulfed his vision. Streams of code and glowing formulas formed a tunnel on his monitor, pulling him inside. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself beneath a vast, star-filled sky. For a fleeting moment, he thought he had simply fallen asleep into a vivid dream. But as he rose from the ground, the truth became clearer. He now stood in the body of the god Nebula. The wind swept against him, stirring emotions so strong they felt unreal. He squinted, scanning his surroundings. The starlight was faint, and he could not tell whether it was the sun or the moon that dimly lit the ruins of a temple. Stone columns, ancient and weathered, surrounded a massive pedestal on which he stood. Yet he could not move. Something unseen restrained him. He studied the temple more closely. The columns resembled the style of ancient Greece, yet this place was no mere ruin of the Parthenon. Stranger still, he glimpsed not one sun, but two. Fear flickered in his eyes. Where was he? He looked exactly like Nebula's avatar from the Lost World. Yet this was no game screen. If this was not a dream, then what was it? How had he come here? A voice called to him, greeting him warmly. Turning, he saw a man robed like a monk. The stranger introduced himself as a line and claimed to be one of the chosen, just like Sun-woon. A troubling question surfaced in Sun-woon's mind. What did it truly mean to be chosen? And more importantly, how did this man know his real name? He turned to Alden and asked what it all meant. Alden simply nodded at the question, clearly approving of his curiosity. With a deliberate gesture, he raised his hand and pointed toward Sunju. Out of the darkness, unfamiliar shadows began to emerge, figures unlike any he had ever seen. Alden stood beside Sunju and explained that they all came from the same world. For fairness, their faces were hidden behind shadows, ensuring the game remained just and impartial. Then, Alden lifted his hands toward the sky and whispered something under his breath. As though dispelling a veil of darkness, magic spread across the space around them. Shapes and lights appeared, and suddenly, a planet manifested above their heads. It resembled Earth, its surface covered in oceans, continents, and swirling clouds. For a moment, he wondered if it truly was Earth, and if they were standing upon the moon itself. But as he studied it closely, he began to doubt. Perhaps this was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. Alden allowed everyone a moment to think. Would they recognize something familiar in that world? Would they understand the truth hidden within it? Then Alden urged them to look more carefully. He recognized it at once. This was not Earth. It was a planet from the Lost World, and they were standing upon its satellite. Nebula Sun-woon stared at Alden, who seemed every bit as enigmatic as the strange world around them. He turned his gaze back to the shadows and began to count. 32 figures stood with him, 32 players, just like in the game The Lost World. Alden explained that the game had never been fiction. It was a reflection of reality. Every mission they had endured, every trial they had faced, had been training. Now, they had the opportunity to transcend their limits and ascend as gods of this world. He continued his story. Long ago, a cataclysm had shattered the Lost World, plunging it into chaos. Once, it had been home to great civilizations, advanced societies that thrived in harmony despite their differences. They shared knowledge, supported one another, and reached astonishing heights of progress. They worshipped deities, believing in their justice and benevolence. But for reasons unknown, the gods abandoned them. Left in despair, the people searched endlessly for hope. Alden confessed that he had created the game to find worthy successors, candidates who could take up the mantle of divinity and guide the real lost world. He turned to Sunju and asked if he was willing to accept this role. Of course, there was an option to refuse, but refusal meant returning to his old life with no memory of this revelation. The rules, Alden explained, would be the same as in the game. They would begin at the lowest rank of existence, gathering the faith of lesser beings to rise in power. Sun Wo's ambition burned bright. He imagined himself conquering the trust of every race, rising above all others, and claiming the title of the sole god of the planet. Alden reassured them that their dreams could come true here. If they chose to embrace godhood, their hopes and ambitions would become reality. Sun Wo considered the offer carefully. If he refused, all of this would be forgotten. If he agreed, the entire world would be his to shape. But surely there had to be a catch. Gathering his courage, he asked Alden what would happen if he changed his mind after accepting. Would he still be able to return to his world? Alden shook his head. Once they chose to play, there would be no escape, no withdrawal, no return. Uneasy, Sun Wo pressed further. What if he failed the mission? What awaited those who lost? Alden's reply was firm failure meant a divine death. Still, he reminded them to enjoy their journey. Just like in the game, this was their chance to realize every ambition, every plan, and every dream they had ever dared to hold. Sun Wo absorbed Alden's words in silence. If the rules mirrored the game, then victory demanded risk. Here, the stakes were higher than ever their very lives. But the battlefield was equal. Each player had the same chance, the same opportunity. They could form alliances or fight alone, all for the same goal, to rise as gods. Finally, Alden's voice cut through the silence. The time had come. They had to make their choice, and they had to make it now. Sunwon wanted to ask a few more questions, but Alden stopped him. For those prepared to accept the challenge, Alden revealed a set of cards. They were placed face down, their contents hidden from view. Each participant would begin their journey by drawing one of these maps. Every card represented a region of the continent where the game would start. Just like the game Sunwon loved so much, the adventure was about to unfold in a familiar yet unpredictable way. In that game, he had been the victor. Could he achieve the same brilliance once more? This time, however, he carried the weight of experience. He knew he had a chance to shape something better, perhaps even a future far brighter than before. As he stood there, Sunwon noticed some of the shadows around him begin to fade. These belonged to those who had chosen to live ordinary lives, withdrawing from the challenge. At the start, there had been 32 participants. 5 withdrew, leaving 27 contenders. The odds were hardly affected, but the tension thickened as the remaining silhouettes drifted closer to Alden. Standing before the altar, Alden gestured toward the cards laid neatly across its surface. He then stepped aside, inviting Sunwon to make the first choice. Sunwon was taken aback. He hadn't expected such an opportunity. The order mattered little, since every selection was random, but still, being first carried its own weight. With careful steps, Sunwon approached the altar. Slowly, he raised his hand over the spread of cards, letting it hover across the row until he stopped at the one in the middle. He turned it over and frowned. His starting point was one of the lowest ranked areas in the game, infamous for its difficulty and low survival rates. It was known as insects. Not literal insects, but a category that included dangerous arthropods and crustaceans. The moment Sunwon absorbed the details of the card, a radiant blue light engulfed him. It rose upward, forming a tunnel that pulled him through. The world spun, turning upside down. He was no longer Sunwon. He had become the god of Nabo. That would be his name now, and along with it came supernatural powers. From above, he gazed upon the planet, divided into 3 great continents. The first was rich in resources. The second flourished with a favorable climate. The third, the one given to him, was vast, but lacked the abundance of the others. No divine power could alter that fact. Zooming closer with his newfound sight, Nebula studied the land. It stretched into a peninsula on the eastern edge of the continent. The terrain was varied: towering mountains, dense forests, and most crucial of all, water, the lifeblood of survival. This oasis nurtured a large tribe of frogmen, amphibious beings who thrived on fish and insects. To watch over them, Nebula created an assistant, a radiant butterfly. He sent it to observe one of the frogmen. The creature crouched by the water, waiting patiently for his prey. His gaze pierced the rippling surface, unblinking, as if he could see into the depths themselves. Their primary food was fish, and they could sit motionless for hours, waiting for the right moment. Finally, the chance arrived. A fish swam past, slow and unsuspecting. In a flash, the frogman lunged, snatching it from the water with practiced precision. His hunt was successful. He raised the fish triumphantly, showing it off to his tribe. Tonight, they would dine well. Then he noticed the butterfly. Its wings shimmered brilliantly in the air, unlike anything he had seen before. For a moment, his hunger shifted. To him, it looked almost appetizing. Frogmen often consumed insects when fish was scarce, but tonight he smiled the tribe would feast on fish instead. Nebula, as the lord of insects, could command his swarm and see the world through their eyes. He sent them out to the right places, observing everything that unfolded before him. Summoning his assistant, Nebula gathered all the information he needed. With that, there was no longer any reason to keep the butterfly stationed within the beastman's territory. His mind turned toward the question of race development. There was no urgency. He had to make the best decision possible. Turning an insect card in his hand, he reflected on the beginning. Things had not started poorly. Much depended on how events would progress. The chosen starting point lay in the eastern part of the continent, on a small peninsula. This location offered safety, a natural advantage. Yet the insect sphere was far more complex than managing minerals or livestock. Minerals could be mined from nearly any land, and food sources could be expanded with relative ease. But insects were different. Frogmen seemed like a potential starting race. They thrived near rivers and lakes and were accustomed to eating insects, though not exclusively. Still, Nebula knew he could not afford mistakes. Every detail mattered. The frogman tribe he discovered in the oasis, however, was too large. They did not need outside help, and the larger the tribe, the harder it was to gain their faith. Faith resources began at just 10 points, fragile and easy to lose. With such a low starting level, Nebula's influence would barely touch them. The answer was clear: he needed to find smaller tribes nearby. So, Nebula sent his scouts beyond the oasis. Ahead lay a vast desert, littered with barren rocks beneath a merciless, cloudless sky. The sun blazed, and the land shimmered with heat. There, he spotted a small group of lizardmen. Their skin carried a bluish tint, and their numbers barely reached 30, likely a band of relatives. They traveled in the opposite direction of their main settlement, and among them, one figure trailed far behind, wounded and weak. Nebula's interest sharpened. Lizardmen were hardy, able to endure harsh environments, and like the frogmen, insects were a natural part of their diet. Their numbers were small, but that worked in his favor. This group, however, was made up of the frail, the sick, the old, and the wounded outcasts cast aside to the mercy of fate. At the very end of the group staggered a young lizardman, grievously wounded. His injuries suggested a brutal battle, perhaps even a failed struggle for power within his main clan. Each step was agonizing, his wounds deep, his body barely holding together. And yet, he pressed on. The more he suffered, the more alone he became, the easier it would be to reach him. Nebula's attention lingered on this broken figure. Against all odds, the youth still carried himself with determination, though he seemed utterly helpless. He looked as though only a miracle, an encounter with a god, could save him. Nebula felt a pang of sympathy. Here lay an opportunity. He studied the lizardman's trail once more and came to a decision. He would begin here with him. A scorching wind swept through the gorge as the blazing sun scorched the sands, their heat shimmering in the air. The small band of outcasts pressed on, exhausted and thirsty, searching desperately for food or water, their hope dwindling with every step. For several days, they had wandered endlessly, searching for any form of shelter. Then, a sudden commotion erupted at the head of the pack. Hope sparked among them, though many feared it might only be another mirage, as so often happened in the desert. But this time, their eyes did not deceive them. A gazelle lay directly in their path, its leg mangled and useless. It was clear the poor creature had already survived one attack, but could not run far. Without hesitation, the lizard men pounced on their unfortunate prey. At last, they would have a proper meal. Tonight, they would eat well and regain some strength. Those who were too weak or wounded to hunt waited patiently on the sidelines, knowing they would only be tossed scraps, often bones. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly throughout their long journey. They had eaten whatever they could find, ants, small birds, and now, by sheer chance, this wounded gazelle. The young lizard men believed that those who risked themselves in the hunt deserved the best share of the kill. The rest would simply accept what was given. It had been so long since they had tasted fresh meat that each bite was savored with loud, greedy smacks. Within moments, the gazelle was stripped to nothing more than a bare skeleton, its remains scattered across the sand. Yet many still had not eaten. Their stomachs growled as they watched the hunters gnawing on bones, desperate for even the smallest scrap. One lizard, who fancied himself their leader, stood tall and regarded the hungry with a steady gaze. At last, he nodded a signal of mercy. He commanded the hunters to finish quickly so something might remain for those too weak to fight for it. The stronger ones could easily have abandoned the sick, but they knew the bitter weight of being cast aside. Gathering the meager leftovers, the leader entrusted them to the eldest, who divided the scraps fairly among those in need. Among the pack was one they called Rocker. In their language, his name meant seriously wounded. He trailed at the back, his presence tolerated by some but despised by others. His leg wound festered, bleeding and rotting, the stink of infection clinging to him. Gangrene had likely set in. Without enough food to restore his strength, his recovery was impossible. Many believed feeding him was a waste of precious resources. Yet there were still those who remembered what he had done for them. Some even owed him their lives. When a saber-toothed tiger had ambushed their group, it was Rocker who had stepped forward alone, shielding the others at the cost of his own body. His terrible wounds were the price of their survival. But the harsher their journey became, the more hostility he faced. To many, Rocker was nothing but a burden. They muttered that his death would free them from carrying dead weight, and some urged openly that he should stop clinging to life. As the day faded, the pale moon rose into the sky, silver light spilling across the sands. Stars glittered brightly beyond thin wisps of cloud. The lizard men, exhausted, huddled together in tight groups, sharing warmth as they drifted into sleep. No one lay beside Rocker. Each step he took now felt as though it might be his last. He despised himself for slowing the pack, for being the obstacle that held them back. Perhaps, without him, they might have already found a new oasis to call home. Unseen by them all, Nebula observed the scene with the aid of his assistant. The suffering, the despair, it was exactly the situation he had been waiting for. As Rocker dozed in the sand, he felt a delicate touch against his face. Fear jolted him awake, his first thought that someone had come to end his pitiful life. Slowly, he opened his eyes, and instead of death, he was met by the sight of a butterfly unlike any he had ever seen. He thought it had to be a mirage. His eyes trailed after the butterfly as it fluttered toward one of the rocks. At its peak, a strange dark fog seemed to linger, and beneath it came faint sounds of chewing. The noise stirred several members of the group awake. They turned their eyes toward Rak, who groaned as he pushed himself upright. No one spoke, they simply watched in silence, waiting to see what he would do. Following the butterfly, Rak began climbing the rock. Something deep within him urged him onward. a pull he could not ignore. His wound throbbed and tore wider with each step, the pain unbearable, but he refused to stop. Every movement was agony, yet he forced himself upward. Those watching from below believed he was trying to leave them behind, to free them of the heavy burden he had become. But Rakrak's determination was not about escape, it was about discovery. His face was twisted in pain, his grip weakening, but still he climbed. A troubling thought haunted him. Was the butterfly even real? He stared at it, unable to decide. Could anyone else see it? Or was it only his vision? If it was real, perhaps it carried meaning, perhaps what it led him to could be their salvation. Desperately clinging to the rock, he refused to lose sight of it. Step by step, he pushed himself higher, scraping his claws against stone to hold on. The climb felt endless, but at last he reached the summit. There, the butterfly rested, perched not on stone, but upon something shifting and dark. It was a swarm. A massive mass of beetles writhed before him, so many that it could feed the entire group for days. His eyes widened in disbelief. How had they overlooked such a treasure during the day? Exhaustion must have dulled their senses, numbing even their ability to smell. With all the strength he had left, Rakrak shouted for the others to come. For the first time in what felt like ages, he was full, truly full. It was nothing short of a miracle. Nebula, watching from his monitor, breathed a sigh of relief. His intervention had borne fruit. The miracle he created was rewarded with faith points, strengthening his resource. The beetles provided enough food to sustain the lizardmen for several days, but Nebula was already calculating the next step. Again and again, when the group faltered, the butterfly appeared to Rakrak. Each time, it guided him to swarms of beetles, and each time, he led his clan to survival. Nebula eventually gave them a name, the Rakrak clan. Some races in the game were naturally more inclined toward belief in miracles, and Rakrak was among them. His faith made him invaluable. Intelligent beings knew that accidents did not repeat themselves so perfectly. To the clan, these miracles could only be the work of a higher power. They came to believe that a deity, the nameless god of beetles, was guiding them. The lizardmen survived their darkest days thanks to these beetles, and so their devotion deepened. Nebula, much to his surprise, was hailed as this god. He found it amusing that they honored him as the god of beetles rather than butterflies, even though the butterfly had been the true guide. Still, he did not mind. Names mattered little. What mattered was that his influence grew. Respect for Rakrak blossomed. His wounds healed under the nourishment of plentiful food, and soon he was recognized as the leader of the clan. Nebula was pleased with his choice. Rakrak was a worthy vessel for his mission. The lizardmen trusted him completely, and that faith only reinforced Nebula's power. Those who had once mocked or mistreated Rakrak now humbled themselves before him, offering apologies. He forgave them, insisting that together they would build the strongest clan possible. The desert sun scorched the earth as it always did, but the clan pressed onward, searching for a permanent home. Once again, the butterfly appeared, and Rakrak was the first to spot it. His sharp hearing and keen sight allowed him to notice even the tiniest flicker of wings. To the clan, it was undeniable proof signs from the god of beetles, leading them again. Yet, a quiet uncertainty began to grow among them. At first, their path had led south, but now the god seemed to guide them northward. The air grew colder with every step. Winter was drawing near, and lizardmen, being warm-blooded, were ill-suited for such a climate. They believed they owed everything to the god of beetles, but to an outside eye, it almost seemed as though they were being led into a trap. In this case, they had no choice but to ignore the signs that had been sent to them. They would have to turn away from the path they once followed, no matter what, and instead search for new sources of life and resources. Rakra was uncertain if it was truly right to dismiss the signs that had once saved their lives. Yet, deep inside, he felt they were making the right decision. The path they had walked before was one of endless suffering and hunger. Food had been scarce, barely enough to keep their bodies moving forward. Unlike the others, however, Rakra carried doubts about these new signs. He remembered the stories from the past tales of an ancient evil that had once destroyed their clans and driven their deities away. Nebula noticed Rakra's hesitation. He could feel the young leader's lack of faith. It was always the same in the beginning of the game. Doubt would gnaw at their hearts. And as always, Nebula could do nothing to force belief. He understood the resource of faith well, its power, its limits, and the risks it carried. Still, he chose to gamble everything. Nebula invested all of his faith points into Rakra's clan. Now, he could only wait and see the result. With this resource, he forged an even greater miracle for them, something powerful enough to erase every doubt about his intentions. If the clan believed, they would flourish. Their lives would become easier, their bonds stronger. Their future would shine, and glory would be theirs. Trusting his instincts, Rakra decided to follow the signs of the beetle god. He prayed his hopes would not betray him. Leading the way, he carried the youngest of their lizardkin in his arms. For days, they followed the butterfly, never stopping to rest or sleep. At last, they saw it a vast swarm of beetles. The impatient ones ran ahead, but the swarm began to drift away, climbing toward the top of a nearby hill. Rakra quickly followed, urging the others to climb. When he reached the top, he was struck speechless by what he saw. The nameless god of the beetles had performed yet another miracle. Before them stretched a paradise. A sparkling lake glimmered under the sun, embraced by a lush forest. Green grasses blanketed the land like a soft, endless carpet. Pointing to this breathtaking scene, Rakra declared to his people that it was their reward for faith. Here they would build their home. Here they would live their happy lives. The clan could hardly believe their eyes. Joy overwhelmed them, as if they had stumbled upon heaven itself in the middle of the desert. Above, the swarm of beetles circled over Rakra, as though marking the completion of their divine mission, before finally dispersing into the sky. Rakra bowed his head in gratitude, and in that moment, his faith deepened within his heart. They had been given a chance at survival. Their choice to trust him and the visions granted by their god had been the right one. From afar, Nebula observed the outcome of his gamble. His faith resource had advanced to the second level, unlocking new opportunities. He had great plans for Rakra, a destiny unlike any other. With this advancement, he could now grant supernatural powers. The system called it God's blessing. Without hesitation, Nebula chose to bestow it upon the brave Rakra. That night, under the soft glow of the full moon, the blessing descended. Silver light spilled through the leaves as a gentle breeze whispered across the trees, weaving a sacred song of renewal. After a satisfying dinner, the flock lay down on the soft grass, finally able to rest in peace for the first time in what felt like ages. Sleep came easily, and with it, Nebula's plan began to unfold. That night, he chose a small firefly, glowing faintly in the twilight, to carry out his will. The firefly drifted closer to Rakra, hovering near his head as he slept. In his dreams, Rakra began to hear a strange voice calling to him over and over. Confused, he found himself standing in an unfamiliar white space. The voice called his name, but all he could see were the colorful butterflies he had been following before. They circled around him gracefully until one of them brushed against his face. The sensation was so vivid, so tangible, that Rakra knew this could not be a dream. Again, the mysterious voice spoke. Rakra asked who was there, and in that instant, he realized it was the same presence that had once guided them through the desert in search of food. As he focused more intently, he discerned the silhouette of a cloaked lizard man, his hood drawn low, butterflies dancing around him. When the figure stretched out his hand, the butterflies landed upon it obediently. It was clear he was their master. This was Nebula, the nameless god of the beetles. Rakra felt the immense weight of his aura: strength, endurance, intelligence, bravery, and justice. These were the very traits that had led Nebula to choose him above all others. Nebula revealed his divine nature and his intent to protect the flock. He asked Rakra to become his priest and to spread his faith among the clan. In return, Nebula promised to grant him whatever he desired. But the choice had to be made immediately. Without hesitation, Rocker nodded in acceptance. Nebula then spoke of what lay ahead. As his priest, Rocker would be granted unique powers and entrusted with sacred tasks. His first mission was to construct an altar for worship. As Nebula spoke, an object suddenly appeared in Rocker's hands, the skull of a great animal meant for sacrifice. Its massive horns jutted out to either side, the sockets of its eyes and nose hollow and dark, while the upper teeth remained firmly intact. Rocker studied it carefully before handing it back to Nebula. The god placed the skull upon his own head, concealing his face. When Rocker touched the skull, knowledge flooded into his mind how to make sacrifices properly and how offerings would strengthen the power of faith. Then Nebula revealed his true form before him, the same skull masking his visage. The sight was terrifying, and Rocker trembled. In the blink of an eye, the vision vanished, and he awoke back at the oasis, his lips still murmuring fragments of the dream. When dawn came, Rocker gathered the clan and recounted the vision. He told them of the god who had chosen him, of his new role as priest of the nameless god of beetles, and of the altar that must be built. Most importantly, they would need to present a worthy sacrifice, a great water buffalo, to give thanks for their new home. But within their small oasis, only small animals could be found. To obtain a buffalo, they would have to leave the safety of the oasis and venture deep into the desert. It was a dangerous undertaking. Before Rocker's rise, the clan had been led by Jay, whose words still carried weight among them. She voiced her concern, warning that a buffalo was no ordinary prey. It was powerful, and bringing one down would require every capable hunter. The battle would be perilous, their lives placed at great risk. Yet, if they were to honor their god, they had no choice but to pursue it. If all the warriors left to hunt, there would be no one left behind to guard the weak and the children. Rocker realized Jaol was right. Risking the clan's safety like that would be reckless. He resolved to take on the task himself. Rising to his feet, Rocker picked up his spear, a long wooden shaft tipped with a finely sharpened stone. It was his most trusted weapon, one he had relied on many times before. He declared that he would hunt alone, refusing to endanger the entire clan. The beetle god had commanded him, and he could not disobey that divine will. Jaol strongly opposed his decision. Though many in the clan trusted Rocker and followed his lead, they could not easily accept such a choice. She confronted him, calling his words arrogant, but Rocker argued back. To him, it wasn't arrogance, he had been granted a divine blessing. Jaol, however, feared he was walking into needless peril. What if his strength was not enough to overcome such a formidable enemy? She reminded him of the grievous shoulder wound that had nearly claimed his life before. Against a beast as powerful as a water buffalo, that weakness could be fatal. In the center of the clearing stood an old, towering tree with thick branches. Rocker leveled his spear toward it, ready to prove his strength. Unbelievably, his wound had healed overnight. His body felt restored, his vitality renewed, and his power greater than ever. Stranger still, his skin had hardened, darkened, and was now covered with black, scale-like ridges that resembled the shell of a beetle. The tribesmen stared in awe, astonished by both his words and his appearance. None of them had ever witnessed anything like this before. Seeing their disbelief, Rocker admitted that he too found it difficult to understand, but it was the truth. Still, Jaol would not yield. His miraculous recovery, she argued, was not enough reason to risk everything by facing such danger alone. Yet Rocker felt the new power coursing through his body. His muscles swelled, his skin thickened, and his grip on the spear grew unshakable. To demonstrate, he raised the weapon in the hand that had once been crippled by injury. With precise aim, he hurled it forward. The spear flew straight and true, not in an arch as it usually would, but in a perfect line. It struck the great tree with thunderous force. The trunk split apart in an explosion of splintered wood, collapsing into fragments. The entire clearing echoed with the sound. The onlookers gasped in astonishment, unable to believe what they had seen. For a moment, Rocker feared that his beloved weapon might have shattered with the impact. But the spear remained whole, buried deep in the ground beside the shattered stump. He walked calmly toward it, grasped it firmly, and pulled it free in a single effortless motion, even though most of its length had sunk into the earth. The clan erupted in praise, their admiration filling the clearing. They questioned why he had kept such power hidden, for it offered them new hope. Rocker, however, could hardly comprehend it himself. He clenched the spear tightly, marveling at his own strength. He was convinced these powers were a blessing from the nameless god of beetles. Not long ago, he had hovered near death with no chance of survival, yet now he stood strong and unbroken. Surely this was the will of their deity. The nameless god had chosen him as priest and vessel, granting him supernatural gifts. Rocker believed this with every fiber of his being. As he retrieved his spear, his gaze turned toward the foot of the hill where all of this had unfolded. His eyes shone with a strange light. Then, suddenly, he saw them. With a voice filled with triumph, he cried out that another miracle had occurred. A herd of water buffalo was approaching the hill, as if brought to them by fate itself. A sarcastic smile curved across his lips as he turned to Jeol. Their argument, he declared, had been meaningless. The gods had already provided the answer. The herd was not large, which greatly improved their chances of success. Some of the buffalo must have strayed from the main group, wandering in search of water. Since this place had never held such a resource before, it was likely they too had lost their way. He lifted his spear high toward the mountain, a sign of his unwavering readiness. The roar of his fellow tribesmen echoed around him, fueling the moment. Rocker believed with absolute certainty that this was the will of the gods. With conviction, he urged his people to raise their voices in praise and to prepare the water buffalo for sacrifice. Jeol, however, urged caution. For everything to succeed, they needed strategy, not reckless passion. The buffalo were fierce and deadly opponents, and Jeol's warning was not without reason. Yet Rocker dismissed her words. With a cry to battle, he hurled himself over the cliff without hesitation, overcome by euphoria and a fearless faith. He believed that with divine aid, starvation would soon be nothing more than a memory. While still airborne, he fixed his gaze on the largest buffalo in the herd. With precise determination, he launched his spear. It struck its target before his feet ever touched the ground. The herd panicked and scattered. Within moments, his clansmen caught up, joining him with wild fervor. The hunt was brutal, but triumph came against all odds. To their astonishment, they captured 5 great buffaloes. Rocker raised his eyes to the heavens in gratitude. The nameless god of beetles had once again proven faithful, not only gifting them a home, but also granting them sustenance. 1 buffalo was left for sacrifice, while the rest became the long-awaited feast for the clan. As the fire crackled and the smell of roasted meat filled the air, Rocker's eyes fell on the skull of the sacrificed beast. He wondered how the nameless god of beetles had guided the herd so perfectly to them. The lizardmen built their first altar from the very bones of the slain creatures, though the structure was unstable. Massive skulls balanced precariously on rough piles of bones. The chosen buffalo for sacrifice was bound to a tall tree above the altar, its blood meant to sanctify the sacred place. Rocker had never led such a ritual before. Doubt gnawed at him, but he followed the voice within his heart. His clan watched every movement closely, awaiting his leadership. Kneeling before the altar, he prayed to the nameless god of beetles to accept their humble offering. The tribesmen bowed their heads as well, showing the only gesture of reverence they knew toward a higher being. From the shadows, Nebula observed. Rocker's ritual was clumsy, yet what mattered most was not precision, but sincerity. His faith burned so strongly that it surpassed all expectation. The ritual proved worthy, even of a novice priest. Nebula was satisfied the effort and preparation had been worthwhile. He had long been orchestrating this moment. Days earlier, he had subtly driven the buffalo toward the hill. He could not control their movements directly, but his command over insects gave him another path. By releasing swarms of locusts to strip the land bare, he forced the buffalo to search for greener pastures. Only one direction remained, the way to the oasis at the foot of the hill. But Nebula's thoughts stretched beyond the hunt. The oasis was small, and its ecosystem fragile. The clan's numbers were still low, so for now they could rely on its meager resources. Yet without knowledge of farming or animal husbandry, survival through the harsh winter would remain perilous. He tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, lost in contemplation. If the lizard men were to endure, they needed more than luck or divine favor. They needed knowledge, and Nebula was already devising how to give it to them. Nebula couldn't reveal anything to them directly, as it would break the rules of the game. It took a long time for the lizard men to gain knowledge on their own. There was another method to hasten their development, but it required careful thought and the proper use of the blessing resource. One by one, Rakra sent blessings to those who made sacrifices and prayed. In return, they grew stronger, healthier, and more capable. Yet happiness and prosperity could not last forever. As the clan expanded, their small oasis could no longer provide enough food. For reasons he could not explain, Rakra suddenly recalled their first altar and the sacrifices made there. That night, he could not rest, tormented by the fear that their oasis would one day fade away. The altar had changed since the beginning. Now it towered high, built from rows of bones adorned with buffalo skulls. At dawn, Rakra rose early and went to look at it. That was where Jia found him. She noticed the worry in his eyes and asked what troubled him. Rakra confessed that he had a disturbing dream. It unsettled him deeply, and he could not tell whether it was prophetic. In his dream, the altar had become small and unstable, just as it had been during the first sacrifice. The lake, which had fed them with fresh fish for many years and saved them from starvation, had dried up completely. Not a drop of water remained. The ground was cracked, barren, and lifeless. Not even a root or blade of grass could be found. Ya tried to reassure him, saying it wasn't so bad, but Rakra was certain their prosperity would not last much longer. The oasis was running out of resources. She reminded him that they were under the care of the nameless god of beetles, and that everything would work out. Rakra agreed that their god had indeed protected them, but only in moments of desperation, when survival seemed impossible and a miracle was their last hope. Frustrated and unable to understand why this was happening, Rakra's anger grew. He climbed to the top of the altar and sat there. In such dire times, he wondered aloud if perhaps they should turn away from their god. Jia looked at him with fear in her eyes. His words unsettled her, and though she did not dare contradict him, she trembled at the thought of abandoning their deity. Sitting atop the altar, Rakra gazed out over the horizon, lost in thought. Then his expression changed abruptly. Ya immediately recognized that he had seen something unusual and hurried to his side. Rakra pointed toward a distant movement, urging her to look closely. Ya squinted, and then her eyes widened in shock. Something was emerging from the hills, moving quickly across the desert in their direction.